Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a brief historical look at the monuments of Glenwood. My name is Dick Ambrus, and I am the Executive Director of Glenwood Cemetery, Inc., and also Glenwood Cemetery Historic Preservation Foundation. Today, we're pleased to partner with Preservation Houston to bring you this summer series. 2021 is an exciting year for Glenwood as we celebrate 150 years of growth and preservation in Houston. We have bold plans for the next 150 years, and as part of our vision, we look forward to welcoming you soon to our new the Center for Glenwood. About 5 years ago, our board charged a building committee to address the vision and needs of Glenwood for the future. And through that planning process, the board agreed to move forward with a new center that would be the primary gathering place for families and friends of Glenwood, as well as a resource for the community. This center will be a space strategically located at the entrance of Glenwood to host education seminars such as this virtual session, and also to conduct historical and horticultural research and serve as an archive for some of Houston's most notable people. We are pleased that the community has funded over $10 million towards our $15 million goal to build the center. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to directly help fund a transformational project for Glenwood, and we invite you to reach out to us or view our website for more details. I look forward to sharing more about our new center later, but for now, I will turn it over to Jim Parsons, Program Director for Preservation Houston. Jim is no stranger to Glenwood Cemetery. He has developed and given approximately 300 tours in the past 20 years, and he is uniquely qualified to share Glenwood's historical past with you. And now, Jim, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Dick. And I look forward to hearing more about the plans for the future of Glenwood at the end of the program. I want to thank the staff at Glenwood for developing the idea for this online program series. Of course, we're dealing with a different world these days still, and there's no substitute for seeing Glenwood in person, but I'm glad that we're able to dig a little bit deeper into the history with these online sessions this summer. And of course, thanks to all of you for spending part of your Saturday morning with us. I also want to recommend a couple of books to you in case you're interested in learning more about Glenwood or about the topics that we're going to talk about this morning. One of them is called Stories in Stone. You see the cover on the left there, written by Douglas Keister, and it's a guide to the iconography and the symbols that you'll find in cemeteries all over the United States and all over the world. It's a handy little book to have if you're interested in this kind of thing. And of course, Houston's Silent Garden is the book about Glenwood, which includes a lot of information about the history of the cemetery, the development of the cemetery, and also a good bit of information on the monuments. So some of the information that I'll give you today was taken from the book, and some of the historic photos I'll show today were taken from the book. So both of these I recommend to you, and I'm not getting any kickback from doing it, but I think they're both books you might enjoy. Let me start this morning with a little bit of Glenwood history. So the cemetery was established in 1871 and had its first burial in the summer of 1872. So we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of Glenwood's founding this summer. It was the first rural garden cemetery in Texas, which means that Glenwood was laid out along the lines of cemeteries that started appearing in Europe in the early 19th century. They had broad park-like grounds and locations that were outside the city centers. And in 1871, Glenwood was on the outskirts of Houston. The garden cemetery movement jumped across the Atlantic to the east coast of the United States in the early 1830s with cemeteries that you might have heard of, like Mount Auburn in Boston, which was founded in 1831, Laurel Hill in Philadelphia from 1836, and Greenwood in Brooklyn from 1838. One interesting note is that in most cases, or in many cases, these cemeteries predated public parks in the cities they were in. Maybe not in the case of Boston, Philadelphia, or New York, but certainly in some smaller cities. And that was the case in Houston as well. So for its first 30 years, Glenwood was the closest thing that Houston had to a landscaped public park. So Victorian Houstonians used Glenwood's grounds not only as a cemetery, but also as a place for picnics and for Sunday drives, which is an idea that I really like. This is an engraving showing a section of Glenwood probably in the 1880s. In the last 150 years, Glenwood has become one of America's premier examples of a Victorian garden cemetery. It's not only an outdoor sculpture garden, as we'll discuss today, but it's also the resting places of scores of fascinating people. And you can visit the cemetery on your own. It's open every day of the week, but I recommend, to really get a sense of the history there and some of the stories, I recommend that you take one of Preservation Houston's walking tours. We offer docent guided tours covering different aspects of the cemetery throughout the year, and you can learn more about those tours and make a reservation at preservationhouston.org/tours. I want to thank Dick and Glenwood for their long-term partnership with Preservation Houston on these tours, and we just love being able to show off one of the most beautiful historic places in town. So for today's topic, Glenwood is a great place to learn about the design of cemetery monuments because it has been around for 150 years, and it has examples of cemetery monuments from the last century and a half, from simple ones to grand ones, from elaborate Victorian designs to clean modern designs. We're going to be taking a look at a few monuments today. As I said, this is no substitute for visiting the cemetery on your own. And one of the exciting things when you visit Glenwood, or when you visit any historic cemetery, is that if you kind of start looking at the symbols and you start looking at the designs of monuments, you'll see them repeated over and over again, and it kind of becomes a treasure hunt when you're walking through the cemetery to see what new symbols and what new monument designs you can find. So I hope that this will maybe teach you something, maybe open your eyes to something that you've seen and didn't really understand, because there is a lot to look at here. There are a couple of things I want to point out as we get started. First of all, Glenwood is a predominantly Christian cemetery, so most of the symbols that we're going to see are rooted in Western Christian traditions, and that's just the historic side of Glenwood. There are newer monuments that reflect Houston's diversity, but those remain the exception at Glenwood and not the rule. I think over the next few years, of course, we're going to see a lot more modern Houston reflected in Glenwood's monuments. And also, you are going to notice that the monuments at Glenwood are in fantastic condition, and that is no accident. The cemetery cleans and restores these pieces so that we can continue to enjoy them. And you'll know, if you visit historic cemeteries regularly, they are not always in the best condition. So we're lucky to have such a well-maintained example of a Victorian cemetery right in our backyard. So I'll start talking about monuments by talking a bit about some of the most common materials that you'll find in Glenwood's monuments, and those are granite and marble. And I'm not basing this on anything scientific. I haven't gone out and counted, but I would say that the vast majority of monuments in Glenwood are either completely or substantially made of granite, like the monument that you see for Charlotte Allen and her daughter Eliza here. And there's a good reason for that. Granite is plentiful, it isn't super expensive, and it wears incredibly well. Granite stands up to weather better than just about anything. And if you look at this monument as an example, it was erected in the late 1890s, and it looks just as good today as it did then. The downside to granite is that because it's such a hard stone, it's difficult to work with if you're trying to do more intricate carving, and that's what brings us to the other material I mentioned, marble. Marble has been a popular material for cemetery monuments for a long time because it's beautiful and because it is easy to carve, and you can really get definition and all sorts of little fine detail that it's very hard to get in granite. So many of the more elaborate monuments that you see in Glenwood will be made of marble. For example, the Wettermark monument that you see here on the right, which is basically right across the road from Charlotte Allen. The disadvantage of marble is that it is not as hard as granite. That makes it easier to carve, but it also makes it not stand up as well to the elements and to time. You've probably seen, if you visited old cemeteries, a marble headstone that is so worn down that you can barely read it, or maybe you can't read it at all. And it's just because of that, because marble is a softer stone. Now, that is not the case with all marble. There are varieties of marble that wear very well, and the Wettermark monument is a good example of that. It's a higher grade of marble that has stood up to time better than some. That kind of explains the difference between these two materials and why people might choose to use one over the other, or in some cases you see a combination of both used at a monument. There are other materials that you'll see at Glenwood, including limestone, cast concrete, metal, and we're going to be talking about some of those later, but most of what you will see today are going to be either granite or marble. So that said, I'd like to move into some of the common symbols that you'll see on Glenwood monuments. And again, these symbols are not unique to Glenwood. They're common in Christian cemeteries and especially cemeteries of Glenwood's age. The first symbol that I want to talk about is the book. And there's a really nice headstone here for Willie Ward and her husband, T.M. Ward, that is shaped like a pedestal with an open book sitting on top of it. And if you look really closely, you can see it's carved to look like the book is sitting on a cushion, which is really nice. The book typically either represents the Bible or the record of a person's deeds in life. You may have heard of the Book of Life before. If it's open, chances are that's what it is. If it's closed, it could either be the Bible or it could be a signifier of a life that's finished. And like the idea is that the book has closed on your life. You'll also notice in Willie Ward's headstone, the draped pedestal. And in Victorian times, it was customary to drape your furniture and your mirrors when you were in mourning. That carried over into cemetery monuments, both as a cultural signifier and, to be honest, as a way to show off, because a pedestal that was carved with drapery was more expensive than a plain pedestal. So you were just kind of showing everybody that you could afford to do something fancy. But it is also very pretty. I should note here that books can also mark the graves of educators or scholars, and I think that that is the case in the monument for Cromwell Anson Jones, who was a noted attorney and judge. You'll see that he has a small stack of books on top of his monument, which kind of made me anxious because it looks like they're about to slide off, but they haven't yet. Cromwell Jones was the son of Anson Jones, who was the last president of the Republic of Texas, and Anson Jones is also buried in the family plot here. Now, flowers are another common type of gravestone symbolism, and they were especially popular in the Victorian era, but you'll see flowers still used on monuments today. I'm using Maud Stedman's headstone here as an example, but you will see flowers all over the place if you start looking at monuments in Glenwood. So Maud's headstone is carved with a daffodil, a lily, a rose, and a fern. And the daffodil and the lily and any flower that grows from a bulb are common in cemetery symbolism because they die out in the winter and then they grow back in the spring. And that's part of the reason that lilies are commonly associated with Easter, because people see bulb flowers as a symbol of resurrection. The rose is an interesting symbol because it can mean different things depending on how it's depicted. So if you have a rosebud, it can stand for youth and innocence. So sometimes you'll see rosebuds on the graves of children or youngsters. As a blossom, like on Maud's, it can indicate beauty and grace. And sometimes you'll see a rose that's fully open, and that can symbolize a long life. So it just kind of depends on the stages of the rose. And the fern may be the most interesting of all, because the fern is a reminder of one of my favorite stories about the Victorians, and a story that's just generally been completely lost today. The fern symbolizes frankness, humility, and sincerity. And the reason is those qualities were considered to be rare attributes in a person, and for a long time, ferns were just as rare. They grew in Central America and the Far East, and Victorians, specifically British Victorians, were oddly fascinated by ferns. By the time Maud Stedman died in 1888, ferns were becoming more common thanks to the adventures of globe-trotting fern hunters who risked life and limb to collect samples of rare ferns and then whisk them back from all over the world to London for cultivation. There are a couple of fern-related engravings here that you see on the left, a couple gathering ferns in the woods, and fern gathering was actually one of the few activities that it was considered acceptable for unmarried Victorian couples to go do on their own, because people thought nothing unwholesome could happen while you were gathering ferns. And then on the right, you'll see a greenhouse that is chock full of ferns with even an artificial waterfall to help keep them humid like they like. If it sounds like I'm getting really excited about fern hunting, I am. And if it sounds like I'm making it sound more exciting than it really was, I'm not. You should do some Googling on Victorian fern mania, and you will be amazed at some of the stories that you find. So you'll still see ferns and other flowers on cemetery monuments today, but these days we don't usually invest the same symbolism in them that Victorians did, so they're usually just more decorative. The one exception I would say is the lily, because the lily has remained a common symbol in Christianity all along. So it's just kind of one of those flowers that you associate with Easter and resurrection, as I said. Let me go off on a quick tangent here while we're still talking about Maud's headstone. We point out on our walking tours of Glenwood that even back in the 1870s and 80s, you could get a mass-produced headstone. You would order it out of a catalog, and the headstone would be carved by hand in Italy in what was called a sculpture factory. And the sculpture factory would employ dozens of stone carvers who would just spend their days turning out basically identical designs over and over and over. So they would be shipped all over Europe. They could be shipped overseas, and that was kind of how you did it. Now, of course, you could have a custom headstone made, but for sort of more average people, you might order it from a catalog and get it made in Italy. You can see Maud's headstone here on the left, and then you can see William Disson's headstone on the right, which are virtually the same design. And if you start looking around Glenwood, you will see repeats of this design or headstones that are, 90 or 95% similar, and those just indicate that they were part of that mass production era. So keeping with the botanical theme for a bit, there's another type of monument that's probably caught your eye before, which is called the tree stone. And the tree stone is what it sounds like. It's a stone monument that is carved to look like a tree. This came out of the Victorian rustic decorative movement when they were crazy about things that were not trees being carved to look like trees. So they would have marble things, they would have metal that was worked to look like trees. It was done in furniture, it was done in architecture, and of course it was done in cemetery monuments here. This tree stone is for a cotton broker named Alexander Sessoms and his wife Mary. It's marble, it's carved with lilies and ferns, as well as a couple of flowers we haven't talked about. There's ivy growing around the tree stone, and that's a symbol of affection, which is indicating that Alexander and Mary loved each other. There are also morning glories on this tree stone, which represent resurrection, because again, morning glories close every night and then open in the morning. One side of the Sessoms tree stone has a wreath of roses. That's on the left there, which is for Mary, because roses were kind of indicative of women. And then the other side has a wreath of oak leaves, which is symbolic of masculinity for Alexander. It really is a beautiful piece, and I'm happy that it has held up as well as it has over the years. A lot of tree stones that you'll see in Glenwood and in other cemeteries mark the graves of members of Woodmen of the World. And it's important to remember, not every tree stone that you see is a Woodman of the World monument. And as we'll learn, not every Woodman of the World monument is a tree stone. But if you're just kind of wandering around an old cemetery and you see a tree stone, there is a good chance that it is a Woodman monument. The Woodmen of the World is a fraternal organization that was founded in 1890 in Omaha, Nebraska. And the main benefit to members of the Woodmen was life insurance, which included covering the cost of a proper burial. So from 1890 up until the 1920s, most all Woodman graves were marked with tree stones. When you died, you got a payout from the Woodmen of the World, and then that money was used to hire a local monument company to carve you this tree stone. And because they were all carved by local companies, they vary in design. Some of them are more elaborate than others because I think you could put your own private money along with the money that you got from the Woodman. They have slightly different symbolism, but they're all basically the same. This one is a really nice example for Robert Burns Jr., who was a freight agent for the Southern Pacific Railroad, who died in 1905. And one thing all Woodmen of the World headstones have in common is the Woodman medallion, which you see here on Robert Burns's headstone. It has the organization's motto, which is Latin for "though silent, he speaks." So that's a common theme, and that's how you can identify whether a tree stone is a Woodman tree stone or not. Around the 1920s, tree stones became too expensive for the standard Woodman burial payout to cover. So the organization started giving its members just more traditional headstones that were carved just with a Woodman medallion. So if you see a Woodman tree stone, chances are it dates to the 1920s or earlier. Now, speaking of fraternal organizations, one of the most common fraternal symbols that you will see in Glenwood and in any other cemetery is the Masonic square and compass, which you see here. This example is from the grave of a guy named J.B. Coates, who died in 1877. And even though this one is nearly 150 years old, the symbol remains the same today. It has a square, which is the V-shaped thing on the bottom. That is a traditional stonemason's tool that was used to judge whether you had carved a stone at a right angle. And then the thing on the top is compasses, a lot like the ones that you might have used in school to draw circles. The G in the center has several meanings, including God and geometry. There's a lot of symbolism tied up in the Masonic symbol, and because I'm not a Mason, I can't explain it all to you, but trust me, it's there. Now, I said a second ago, the Masonic symbol has not changed a lot over the years, and that's true. If you see a modern Masonic symbol, it's going to look a whole lot like this one from 1877, but that's not to say it hasn't changed at all. And there's another monument not too far from J.B. Coates for Robert Wilson, who died in 1856. So his headstone was actually located elsewhere. Wilson was buried in another cemetery, and then he was moved into Glenwood after it opened, and his headstone came with him. But what you see here in this 1856 version of the Masonic symbol is the basics. You see the square and the compasses, but there's no G. So the G appeared at some point. And I will note, it also looks like, if you look at the square here, it looks like it doesn't have any measurement markers on it. You may have noticed on J.B. Coates's, the square was kind of marked to look like a ruler. I think Robert Wilson's square actually does have measurement markers, but I think they've worn down because it's softer marble. But on some Masonic symbols, you won't see those measurement markers. And that's actually more true to history, because a true Mason square wasn't really used to measure distance. It was used to measure angles. So it's just one more thing that has kind of been tweaked and changed over the years. But the basics of the Masonic symbol are very easy to identify, and you can spot those all over the place. Moving away from fraternal symbols, we come to hands, which you see a lot on older monuments, and they can be doing different things. Sometimes hands are pointing up towards heaven, sometimes they're pointing down toward the name on the grave, sometimes they're doing something else entirely, like here on the headstone for Catherine Townsend, who died in 1890. So her husband had died about a year before she did, and what you see on her headstone is two hands that are clasped, and if you look really closely, you can see the hand on the left is wearing a woman's dress and the hand on the right is wearing a man's suit. So what this is symbolizing is that Mrs. Townsend and her husband are now reunited in death. And this is actually a pretty common thing with a man's and woman's clasped hands if you start looking at hands on headstones around Glenwood. And finally, I want to mention another common Glenwood symbol, which is angels. Now, of course, angels are deeply rooted in Christian tradition. There are some pretty spectacular renditions at Glenwood. And kind of like the hands, angels can be depicted doing a variety of things. Sometimes they look like they're thinking, sometimes they look like they're just kind of being sad, sometimes they're pointing toward heaven, sometimes they're just standing there being angelic. The three angels you see here are from the George Herman plot on the left, the Farb plot in the center, and then the W.R. Baker plot on the right. But there are many more examples at Glenwood, as I said, doing different things. We are going to talk about a couple of extra notable Glenwood angels in a few moments, but I want to take a diversion here to talk about a couple of other angel-related things. First of all, cherubs, or little kid angels who mark the graves of children, like these that are on the T.W. House plot. And actually, I say these, it's actually a cherub on the right, and the cherub, I think, is helping the child who is buried here, probably to heaven on the left, is what I'm guessing. It's important to remember that childhood mortality was much higher in Glenwood's early days than it is now. They didn't have treatments or vaccinations for a lot of the illnesses that we consider common. So losing a baby or a child, unfortunately, was just part of life for these early generations of Glenwood folks. And so you do see a lot of children's graves, not all as elaborate as this one, but there's some really touching symbolism out there. There are also figures at Glenwood that look like angels, but are not angels, and you can tell because they don't have wings. Sometimes these statues are in comforting poses. Sometimes you see them extending a hand like they're offering flowers. Sometimes they're religious themed. They might be holding a cross and looking toward heaven. The figure that you see here is on the plot of Harriet Smith and her daughter Maria Boswell Flake, and it is a statue of the virtue of hope. So what this is a physical embodiment of hope and comfort. And the figure of hope, when you see her, is almost always holding an anchor. And you can see this one has a relatively small portable anchor, but sometimes you see hope with an anchor that is as big as she is. The idea is that our souls are tossed around on the storms of life, and hope is the anchor that keeps us steady. So that's what they're trying to show you. One note is that this entire monument, the base and the statue, are carved from granite, which is unusual because, as I said, granite is not that easy to work with. This one was done by the Mitchell Granite Works in Quincy, Massachusetts, in the very early 20th century. There are also statues that are called weepers, and that pretty much does what it says on the box. It's a statue that is meant to be like an eternal mourner at a gravesite. This weeper is on the plot of the Dunn family, and it's a really nice example of just somebody who's supposed to be standing there for eternity looking sad. I don't know if you can tell because of the coloration in this picture, but this is a mixed media monument. The main part of the monument is granite, and then the statue of the weeper is marble, because again, easier to carve marble than granite. So having said all that, there are lots of other symbols that we could talk about, and we will pick up a couple more as we go on, but I wanted to move into some specific notable monuments at Glenwood and the stories behind them. And I'm going to start with one of the best known angels at Glenwood. This one is called the Statue of Grief, and it marks the plot of the wife and children of businessman and civic leader E.P. Hill. The piece was placed around 1904, and it was carved by the Tyke Monument Works of Llano, Texas, which was one of the premier stoneworks in Texas around the turn of the century. It's a tribute to a statue called the Angel of Grief, which you see on the right here, that was done by an American sculptor named William Wentmore Story in 1894 for his wife's grave in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. Now, Story's sculpture became very popular, not only because it's beautiful, but because it showed an angel expressing emotion. And up until this point, people hadn't really thought about angels expressing emotion. They were just supposed to be standing there looking angelic. But Story kind of gave the angel human qualities because the angel's clearly distraught and is draped over this pedestal. So the Angel of Grief was widely published around the world, and it spawned a generation of copies, including the one that you see on the left at Glenwood. Glenwood's angel is not an exact copy of the one in Rome, but if you ran into the one in Rome, you would instantly recognize it. The Statue of Grief at Glenwood is carved from a single block of Carrara marble. And if you'll remember, I said earlier, some marble doesn't hold up as well as others. Carrara marble, which is quarried in Italy, is considered to be some of the best in the world, and it's been used for monuments and statuary since antiquity, and it's still highly prized today. One note about the Statue of Grief here, if you look closely, and I should mention the difference in the coloration here, the picture on the left is the Statue of Grief when it had recently been cleaned, and the picture on the right is from just the other day. And you know, in hot and humid Houston summers, you're going to just pick up a little bit of coloration and moss and that kind of thing on these statues. So that's why it looks different. But you'll notice that the hand on the figure that's draped over the pedestal there doesn't quite match up in color with the rest of the piece. You can see on the wrist where it changes color. That's because the hand is only a few years old. The original hand for this piece had either fallen off or been knocked off years and years ago. And a few years back, the Glenwood Historic Preservation Foundation brought in a sculptor named Eric Capasta to model a new hand to match the original. And he was able to use historic photos to base the design of the new hand on. And some days when you visit Glenwood, it's almost impossible to tell that the hand is new. But when it's damp, like it is this summer, that difference in color actually shows up. I should note here, Eric Capasta, the sculptor who did this hand, you may not know his name, but chances are you will know one of his other works, which is the pile of oranges in the back of the home run train at Minute Maid Park. So he is definitely a man of many talents. Next up, we have another piece from the Tyke Monument Works. It's the Angel at the Grave of William Donovan, which is known these days as the Avenging Angel. And there's a long, pretty complicated story behind this sculpture, which we tell on our walking tours, and I will distill it way down today, but if you come on the tour, you'll get the full thing. William Donovan, who's buried here, was a rice planter down to the southwest of Houston. He linked up with a businessman named W.T. Eldridge, and they sort of formed a sugar syndicate. Eldridge encouraged Donovan to get into sugar as well as rice. Their partnership eventually went south, and Donovan sort of became fixated on Eldridge at that point. He blamed Eldridge for everything that had gone wrong in their business dealings, and he started threatening to kill Eldridge. Long story short, they avoided each other for a while, but they eventually encountered each other aboard a train. They both drew their guns, and Eldridge shot Donovan. So Donovan died of his gunshot wound, and his sisters, Margaret and Adelia, had this monument built at Glenwood. It consists of a granite sarcophagus that is covered with carvings about Donovan's life. And literally, if you walk over to the far side of the monument, it says, here are some of the excerpts in the press about how wonderful William Donovan was. And then it has like quotes listed from newspapers. It's guarded by a statue of the Archangel Michael, who is packing a sword. and a pretty intense expression, so you can see why people call it the Avenging Angel. Now, sticking with statuary for a moment, I want to mention a couple of the full-length portrait statues in Glenwood that are statues that show actual people who were buried there. They have very different origin stories, but I think it's interesting to note that both of these Victorian-era portrait statues show their subjects as if they're headed to work. This one is the monument to George Austin Quinlan, who was an executive with Houston and Texas Central Railroad. He died in 1901, and the $3,000 cost of this monument was covered with contributions from the railroad and its employees, because apparently they thought he was such a good guy that they raised the money for his cemetery monument. So there's a granite base, as you see here, and then it is topped by a cast concrete statue of Quinlan, dressed for the office and carrying what look like some important papers. They may not be important papers, they may be his grocery list, I don't know, but he's in his business suit, he's got his watch chain, he is ready to go. Not too far away from there is the Fireman's Monument, which is in the plot that was purchased by Houston's volunteer fire department back in 1888. And the monument here was unveiled in 1900 after a long fundraising drive by the firefighters. So it consists of a marble and red granite base that is topped by a Carrara marble statue of Robert Brewster, who was the oldest living Houston firefighter at the time the monument was commissioned. He had joined Protection Number 1, which was the city's oldest fire company, back in 1840. And the statue of Brewster was carved in Italy using photos that were sent over from Houston. It is life-sized at 5 feet 2 inches tall. And you don't usually get to see him up close this way, but you do if you have a good zoom lens on your camera. I should mention Robert Brewster is buried at Glenwood, but he is not in the firefighters plot. He's actually over closer to the Statue of Grief, and he has a beautiful Celtic cross on his grave. Now, the firefighters plot was initially meant for the burial of firefighters who died in the line of duty, but it went unused for decades after an early group of firefighters was buried there. There have been a few burials made there in recent years, including Ann Sullivan, who was one of 4 firefighters who died in the Southwest Inn fire in May 2013 out on the Southwest Freeway. Sullivan had graduated from the Fire Academy just the month before this fire happened. She was the 4th woman firefighter in Texas to die in the line of duty and the 1st woman firefighter in Houston to die in the line of duty. I just wanted to show you her headstone in the firefighters plot, front and back. Sullivan was always known for wearing a ponytail, and so that's what you see on the back of the stone is her silhouette with the epitaph, "Courage has a ponytail," which I really like. Now, I'll mention a couple more notable sculptures here. First of all, one of the newest additions to Glenwood, this is the Lester Smith Monument, which features a striking cast stone sculpture of a lion laying on top of Smith's sarcophagus. The monument was built earlier this year for Lester Smith, an oil man who died in 2019, and his wife developed the design for the monument, including the lion. And the lion is based on one of a pair of lions that were carved by an Italian sculptor named Antonio Canova in 1792 for the tomb of Pope Clement XIII in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So Lester Smith's lion is based on the right-hand lion at the Vatican that you see in this picture here. If you'd like to see some Canova lions closer to home, there are bronze casts of the Vatican versions outside the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and there's also a set of replica Canova lions at Tower Grove Park in St. Louis. But now you can just go to Glenwood and see one. And finally, sculpture-wise, we have Solitude, which is a modern piece by a French artist named Marcel Bourrain that sits at the grave of Dr. Alan Hurd and his wife Ethel Hurd. Alan died first in 1926, and after his death, Ethel traveled to Paris to choose a piece of art to serve as his monument in Glenwood. Now, the Hurds had both served in World War I. Alan Hurd was a Army medic, and Ethel Hurd was a volunteer nurse with the Red Cross. And so when Ethel Hurd met Marcel Bourrain, the artist, something in his story resonated with her because Bourrain himself had been in the war on the French side, and he was taken prisoner by the Germans during the war. So he sculpted Solitude to depict France's grief over the ravages of the war, and Ethel thought it was the perfect piece to bring back and put on their plot. It's made of Constone, which is a prized type of limestone from northwestern France, and it really is a beautiful piece. Now, there are some monuments at Glenwood that really reflect the character or the specific attributes of people. The monument for real estate developers Henry McGregor and Frank Demerit is one of those. McGregor and Demerit together developed subdivisions in the early 20th century in what was then called the South End of Houston. It's the neighborhoods that we now know as Midtown and the Museum District. So sort of between the Pierce Elevated and Herman Park is the area they were working in. And McGregor and Demerit would distinguish themselves by planting trees in their new neighborhoods, which a lot of other real estate developers didn't do. So that's what their monument commemorates, with the 2 trees that you see there. And this is actually a twofer in terms of symbolism, because the trees not only symbolize the way that they develop neighborhoods, but it symbolizes their partnership in business and in life, because McGregor and Demerit were brothers-in-law. The McGregor Monument also has a little verse by Peggy McGregor, who was Henry's wife, and it says, "Wherever he builded, he planted trees, leaving a gift of grateful shade and beauty," which is kind of nice. And by the way, builded sounds odd to us today. We would normally say wherever he built, but builded was common use in the 1920s, so that's what got committed to stone. Another of my favorite monuments with a personal connection belongs to Lane Patterson, who was a young artist who died in 1990 of AIDS. He had been sick for 2.5 years before he died, and during that time, he did a painting with the handprints of various family members. They would dip their hands in different colored paint and they would put them on the canvas. And the handprints were centered on the words, "I am part of all I've met," which is a line from Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So Patterson's monument in Glenwood is based on that painting. You can see the multicolored handprints and you can see the text from Tennyson in the middle. And if you go around back, it even has Patterson's signature on it, because it is actually based on his artwork. Now, there are other monuments at Glenwood that have to do with specific burial methods, and I want to talk about a couple of those really quickly. There are a handful of mausoleums in the cemetery which allow people to be entombed above ground instead of being buried in ground. Mausoleums are much more common in cemeteries in other parts of the country. You may know that they're the norm in New Orleans, not only for high water table reasons, but also for cultural reasons. In Glenwood, they are really just a way for lot owners to kind of differentiate themselves and do something that's a little bit of a standout. Most of the mausoleums in Glenwood date from the early 20th century, and they were not necessarily built out of necessity. They were built really to take advantage of a sloping site that overlooked what had been a lake. There was a basin as part of Glenwood's original design that was filled in 1919. So these earliest mausoleums that you see along this road would have had a view out over that lake once upon a time. So the first mausoleum to be built in Glenwood, and maybe the finest, was built in 1907 by oilman John O'Neill for his wife Cora, who died at age 26 of blood poisoning. O'Neill had the mausoleum designed in New York and built by a Pennsylvania company. It has a classically inspired limestone exterior and an interior finished in marble and bronze, and just a really nice example of kind of what a classical mausoleum would have looked like. There's another intriguing monument that has to do with a specific burial method that marks the grave of Bessie, and I never know how to pronounce her last name, so I'm going to say de Lesdernier, but I'm sure that that's wrong. It's a French last name that I am mangling. Bessie died in 1874 at age 2, and she was buried using a method that was patented in 1873 by an Alabama man named Joseph Abrams. And what you see on the right here is part of Abrams' actual patent filing for his burial method. I'm going to describe it to you, and you may be able to tell it from the patent drawings. So what Abrams was trying to solve was modern burial vaults had not been invented at that point, and they had a problem with when you were buried, eventually the ground would settle into the grave, and that would cause an uneven surface above ground, and it would also allow water to collect. And when water collected, you could get mosquitoes, and they didn't quite know why mosquitoes were bad health-wise. They didn't know that mosquitoes carried yellow fever, but they knew they didn't like mosquitoes, so you wanted to try to avoid that if you could. So what Abrams invented was a method where the casket was buried as usual, and then the casket would be covered with arches that were made of brick or metal, and you can kind of see that in that top part of the drawing. The arches were then covered with concrete to form a sort of structure that would prevent the ground from settling. So it filled the same function as a modern burial vault, but it was actually a built structure underground. The visible part of all this was a brick or concrete pad at ground level that had an ornate cast iron cover, and that's what you see on the left there. You could order different designs for this cast iron cover from a catalog, and Bessie's cover features a figure of a baby resting on a bed of oak leaves and acorns. Now, we talked about the classically inspired O'Neill Mausoleum, but there are other monuments that take their inspiration from different periods of history, like the High Gothic Johnson Monument, which was probably built in the early 1880s to mark the grave of Philadelphia Borden Johnson. Gothic architecture had its roots in the Middle Ages, but it had a renaissance in the 19th century thanks to some high-profile building projects like the Houses of Parliament in London, which really elevated Gothic architecture in the public mind. The Johnson Monument itself might have been inspired by a design from this Gothic revival. It could have been perhaps the Scott Monument in Edinburgh that you see on the left that was finished in 1844, or the Albert Memorial in London on the right from 1872. Certainly has the same shape as these, although it's on a much smaller scale. There are other Glenwood monuments that borrow ancient Egyptian elements, which have been popular for many years. The most common ancient Egyptian form you'll find in a cemetery today is probably the obelisk, which is the tapered square stone shaft with a pointed top. Obelisks got their start outside of temples in ancient Egypt, and they were supposed to represent the rays of a sun, or the rays of the sun as it came down to earth. Obelisks caught the attention of the Western world in the late 1700s, and then when the United States got its independence, we considered them to be kind of tasteful and patriotic, which explains why the Washington Monument is a giant obelisk. There are dozens of obelisks at Glenwood, and they range in size from shorter than me to almost as tall as the Washington Monument. That's the case with the Henderson obelisk, which is the biggest of all. It was placed in 1931 on the grave of James Henderson, who was governor of Texas for 4 weeks in 1853. His son ordered this obelisk to be placed on his father's grave after his son died, so that's why it wasn't put up until 1931. It's 44 feet tall, so about the height of a 4-story building. And when it was put up, it was said to have been the largest single piece of stone ever erected in the United States. You can't really get a sense here of exactly how tall it is, but if you look at the other headstones around it and you look at the trees, you can kind of tell. You can also see Egyptian influences on the plot of lumberman W.T. Carter's family. The elegant central monument here that was designed in the early 1920s features carvings of papyrus on the upright parts, which symbolizes life and wisdom. And then at the top, you can see that there is a disc with 3 sets of wings on either side. And the 3 sets of wings represent good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. The winged disc itself is an ancient Egyptian symbol of everlasting life. You'll find a variation on that winged disc on all of the headstones of the Carter family. They have kept this going for many generations in their headstones. It's worth remembering here, when the Carter family plot was built, there was kind of an Egyptian mania in the 1920s that was set off by Howard Carter's discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922. So you would have seen in the 1920s an Egyptian influence in architecture, graphic design, fashion, and obviously cemetery monuments. Now, I've spent most of my time this morning talking about monuments with traditional designs, but I want to spend my last couple of minutes talking about a few of the cemetery's more modern monuments. There are a couple of wonderful plots from the Art Deco period, including this one belonging to the family of Howard Hughes Sr. The Hughes plot was designed by William Ward Watkin, the first dean of architecture at Rice University, and it was built in 1935 as a semicircle of slender bronze trumpets that were set against a wooded hillside, as you see in this photo. Then when Howard Hughes Jr., who's the Howard Hughes we're familiar with, died in 1976, architects Charles Tapley and Ralph Ellis Gunn enlarged the plot, moved the trumpets into a newly built wall that complemented Watkin's Art Deco design, and they also created 2 new trumpets to supplement the original 4. It's interesting that it was built in 2 phases 40 years apart, but the design of the 2 phases works so well together. There's a great story here that the bronze trumpets were based on Howard Hughes Sr.'s favorite watch fob. Howard Hughes Sr. apparently loved this little gold watch fob that was shaped like a saxophone, and William Ward Watkin wisely decided it was a better idea to translate that into Gabriel's trumpets than to put a series of saxophones on the Hughes plot, although that would have been more fun for us. Another Deco-inspired plot was built for insurance executive James Cravens in the late 1930s, and this one was done by sculptor William McVeigh. He designed and executed the granite wall that serves as the family monument. As you can see, the plot is encircled by low brick walls and hedges, so it actually kind of reads as a private garden, which is really nice. McVeigh, on that wall, I'm sorry, I keep saying the wall is granite, it's limestone. On this limestone wall, he carved 2 panels of pomegranate trees, which he used to represent the tree of life. And then he centered them on a bronze relief of kind of an Art Deco angel holding a calla lily. It's a really beautiful piece of work. McVeigh is not the only well-known modern sculptor to be represented at Glenwood. Artist Jim Love has pieces on 2 plots that are related to the Brown family. There's an oak leaf sculpture that you see on the left on the plot of George and Herman Brown, the brothers who were behind Brown and Root. And then on the right is another Jim Love oak leaf on the plot of Isabel Brown Wilson, who was George Brown's daughter. The oak leaf on the left was sculpted for the plot. The oak leaf on the right started out in Isabel Wilson's backyard, and it ended up on her cemetery plot. But I like that they complement each other, and they're more or less catty corner from each other, so you can kind of see the family connection there too. The plot of attorney Anne Cox Kohler has a piece by Joseph Havel, who was the longtime director of the Glasell School of Art. You may be familiar with Havel's sculptures that look like gravity-defying pieces of fabric, and that's what you see on the Kohler plot. Havel did a similar piece at the entrance to the Museum of Fine Arts Beck building in 1999, where he made folded metal panels that look like curtains that have been drawn back to let you into the museum. Architect Jay Holdenberger designed a set of 9 black granite cubes for a plot that was meant for himself and a group of close friends who wanted to be buried together. Their names are inscribed on the outer faces of each cube. And I really like this one because it's minimal, it's elegant, and it's very different from most of what you see at the cemetery, and doesn't have any historical symbolism to it, but it's a very powerful piece. And it's kind of back in a secluded spot at the edge of a ravine, so it's got this nice green background to it as well. You see a similar geometric theme in the Arnold plot, which is among the newest at Glenwood. It was built out just a few years ago, and instead of granite cubes, the design uses a pink granite wall that's inset with 6 plain white marble panels. So this is also elegant and modern, and what I like about it is it's among older plots, but it fits in really well with some of the older, more ornate monuments nearby. You can't tell from this photo, but this is in the same vicinity as the Statue of Grief on the Hill plot and the Wettermark monument that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So again, just different generations of design coexisting there. And I want to wrap up with one of the most interesting modern monuments in the cemetery. It's the one that architect Burdett Keeland designed for himself. Keeland had a lifelong interest in the design of cemeteries, and he spent a lot of his life studying and documenting and collecting material for a book about cemetery design that was never published. He believed that we should treat cemeteries not only as burial places, but also as parks full of history and art, which is exactly how I like to think of Glenwood. So Keeland's own monument, which he designed and was erected after his death in 2000, is his personal expression. It's a circle, a triangle, and a square suspended from this thin metal frame. And if you go around the other side from where this photo was taken, the names of the people in the plot are inscribed on those geometric shapes. Keeland once said, "People shouldn't be afraid of looking at death as an opportunity for an architectural statement," which is exactly what an architect would say, right? There is one more thing about the Keeland plot I want to point out. Visitors have left pebbles on top of those geometric elements in the monument, and leaving pebbles or stones on a gravesite is most common in Jewish tradition, where it has its roots in thousands of years of Jewish history. I don't believe that the Keelands were Jewish, but I do like the idea of leaving a small stone to show that you visited a gravesite. And I wanted to close with this because I think this is a nice reminder that cemeteries and the monuments in them are for us, for the living, to visit and appreciate. And everywhere you go at Glenwood, you can see signs that people are doing just that. And that makes me really happy that we're treating Glenwood as it's always been intended, not only as a cemetery, but as a park. I hope what you've seen today will help you take a new look at the cemetery next time you visit. And if you take some time, I guarantee you're going to find some treasures of your own. So with that, Dick, if you wouldn't mind coming back, we can wrap up and then see what questions folks have.
All right, Jim, that was really a great presentation. I've been at this for almost 40 years, and I learned a great deal during this past 30 minutes or so. And I want to thank you and Preservation Houston for putting this on and partnering with Glenwood Cemetery. Finally, I want to share some additional thoughts with you on the new center and give you a little bit more description about what it will entail. The center will encompass about 14,500 square feet and include such things as an assembly room with kitchen facilities, an archive and genealogy room, and a large reception area and adequate parking, something that we've lacked here in our existing location for a long time. We're also excited about having completed a new maintenance facility that helps with the upkeep of our beautiful monuments and our grounds, landscape maintenance. The new maintenance facility encompasses an area containing a little bit over 1 acre and land area and about 13,000 square feet of covered maintenance buildings. And now we're pleased to be breaking ground soon for the Center for Glenwood. But we still need your support to reach out, to reach our goal. And again, I invite you to visit our website, call to learn more about how you might get involved. We have several ways to recognize our generous donors, and we don't want you to miss this once in a lifetime opportunity that will be recognized in perpetuity. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. I would be pleased to answer any questions you have during our question and answer session, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jim at this point. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dick, and thanks to everybody who is sticking with us here. We'll now start answering your questions. So again, if you have questions for me or for Dick about anything you've heard today or anything you haven't heard, go ahead and use that Q&A feature. If you look for the 2 little speech bubbles in the icon, you can type your question in there. If you can't get the Q&A to work, type it in chat, and we will get to them. So Dick, this first one is for you because I do not know the answer to this. How old? I picked the hardest one first. How old? Yeah, that's what everybody wants to know. No, how old is the cemetery oak? And you might describe what the cemetery oak is too.
Well, the cemetery oak is one of our largest live oak tree in the cemetery. And I've done some research on that, and based on the layout of the area that it's in, which dates back to the first part of the 1900s, lots were plotted in at that point, but had not been sold, and there were walkways plotted into the plat for that area. And I pegged the age to be around 130 years, maybe a little bit older than that, but not much because of where it's located. Right now, it spans out over several grave sites, and people wouldn't have buried people underneath a large tree back then. I mean, it would have been a much smaller live oak when those burials took place, and they just kind of grown over grave sites. So around 130 years, give or take.
And we didn't mention it today, but if you haven't seen the cemetery oak, it's worth taking a trip out to Glenwood to see. It's really spectacular. It shows what an oak tree can do when it doesn't have anything standing in its way, which is pretty impressive.
It's in a prime area in Glenwood.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of questions about the Center for Glenwood, Dick. Stephen asks, where will the Center for Glenwood be located? He is guessing it's going to be on the side of the main entrance where construction's happening.
Well, as you drive in the cemetery and you look off to your left and you see construction fencing, it's going to be on the left-hand side as you come into the cemetery. And just as a matter of interest, the cemetery entryway is going to be relocated about 60 feet to the east on Washington Avenue, so that we can have a more expansive entry into the cemetery and take advantage of the view of the new center, along with a vista that'll be very, very beautiful.
It's going to be nice, and I will say, as someone who visits Glenwood a lot, having a parking lot is also going to be nice.
Hey, absolutely.
Which I bet y'all are going to be looking forward to too.
We are.
We had this question, I think, last session, but it's come up again. Maybe you've come to a conclusion on this one. What about the historic office cottage? What are the plans for it after the new center is built?
Well, that's a good question, and we get asked that a lot. There are no plans to eliminate the office cottage. We're going to keep it and repurpose it for probably small family gatherings and different functions that family gatherings, maybe even weddings. I mean, it can be used for a number of things. The only problem with it is parking. There is no parking. You have to use the street to park your vehicles, but the plans are to keep it intact and repurpose it.
It's a beautiful little building, and I think that people don't realize that it's as old as it is. Sometimes it was the original part of it was built in 1888, I believe.
Right. The part that the main part as you come in was built in 1888. And the part that I'm now sitting in, which is our conference room, was built in 1995. There was an addition put on to the building, which you can't really tell it's an addition. We took everything down to the studs and kind of built it back, and then added some footage for conference room, some small kitchen and bathroom facilities. I might mention, this is a little bit of history, but I started in Glenwood around 1983 in that vicinity. And when I got here, the cottage, the 1880 part was basically a one room room. And there was no air conditioning. There was no bathroom facilities. You had to go outside and go around the side of the house to use the restroom. So one of the first things I did was put an indoor restroom in. And that's not all that long ago, almost 40 years, but you wouldn't think at that late a date that, you wouldn't have that kind of a facility in your facility. So
now, is the new center for Glenwood going to have indoor bathrooms, or are you going to do the outdoor again?
I'll ignore that question, Jim.
No, I thought it was a good question. Right.
No, there's going to be public and private facilities, and it's going to be first class.
It looks like it will. I've got a couple of questions here that I can take. And let's see that Mark Williamson asked if the W.T. Carters, who had the Egyptian themed plot, were related to the archaeologist Howard Carter. And Mark, I think that's a good question. And I don't think they were. Howard Carter was British and was. I don't think there was any connection. I think it just happens to be one of those coincidences that's fun. And Lisa asked if we could briefly repeat the symbolism of ferns on grave markers, and I'm happy to, because it's one that we don't think about that often. Ferns, among other things, symbolized humility and frankness and sincerity. So it was what the Victorians thought were three of the rarest qualities in a person, because ferns were also really rare. And I cannot stress enough, I get really excited about Victorian fern hunters, but if you read about it, I mean, there were Victorian guys who would go and like rappel down the sides of mountains to collect fern things. And, they were all wearing suits and top hats and whatever because they were Victorians, but it's a pretty wild story. Maybe not top hats. I'm sure they had something more appropriate. Let's see. Dick, we got another question about the center. Donna asked if how the genealogical area is going to be managed, and will it have any connection with like the Clayton Library or anything like that?
Well, I think we would try to partner with the Clayton Library or some other organization that would help us put that together. We're going to provide all of the historical data that we have here at Glenwood and make that available to people who are interested in that. But I think we probably would try to partner with someone like Clayton Library.
Okay. Yeah, that's an exciting part, because I think people don't realize too that Glenwood has 150 years of records that could be of use to a lot of people.
That's correct.
Now here's another question in the realm of cemetery management. Considering that some of the monuments have some expensive features, has there been any theft in the history of Glenwood?
Not necessarily theft, but we've had some damage done over the years. Not lately, knocking on on some wood. But the last event that I recall that took place that was significant was in the mid 1990s. And back then, the area that we are in right now was a different, we were in a different, I won't say cultural situation, but the area was, downslope. And we had some significant vandalism back then, which, by the way, we wound up restoring just about all of it. Eric Pasta, who you mentioned earlier, actually did several restorations for me here at Glenwood. And the arm on the angel was done by Eric. The Grieving Angel was done by Eric Pasta. He's done a significant amount of restoration work here, and he's a very talented guy, talented artist.
Did Eric also restore the angels at Leonard Tharp's plot?
Sure did. And I wish we had pictures of that. You'd be blown away by, you had a basket of parts, and he took that basket of parts, which was the parts of the angels that were vandalized, and put it all together where you can't tell the difference between before and after. It really was a magnificent job.
If you next time you go out to Glenwood, if you go to Howard Hughes's plot, if you turn and look right across the road from Howard Hughes, there's a plot, an elevated plot with steps that lead up to it, and two angels on either side of the stairs, and those are the ones we're talking about. And you can't tell that they were ever that they had to be.
They were literally in bits and pieces. And
yeah.
He put it back together.
He also, if I remember right, he put the sword back on the Avenging Angel.
He did.
And he did some pretty amazing
and
stuff.
He put some heads back on, rearranged some noses, put some fingers on. I mean, he's done a lot of things that you wouldn't think you would find in the cemetery. So
you don't think about plastic surgery at Glenwood, but
yeah, he was a plastic surgeon in Glenwood. I didn't thought about that way. But
go ahead.
I was just going to say we're fortunate to find him to do that. And he's still doing work for us now.
I think this is a good chance to mention the Glenwood Foundation versus the cemetery itself. And could you talk a little bit, Dick, about the difference between Glenwood Cemetery and the Historic Preservation Foundation?
Well, the foundation was formed in 1999, and it's a supporting organization to Glenwood Cemetery, Inc., or the operating entity of Glenwood. And it was formed for the purpose of, raising money for, quote, monument restoration, erosion control, trees, enhancing our landscape areas, and things of that nature. And it's been a very successful operation since that date. Right now, as I had mentioned earlier in this program, we're raising money for the new Center for Glenwood, and of course that's being done through the foundation. So it's a supporting organization to Glenwood, and Glenwood is the only member of the Historic Foundation. So it's part of Glenwood.
And it allows the foundation, if I'm not wrong, has allowed like some of that monument restoration to go on.
Right, and it's also a 501c3 organization, which is a required designation by other foundations to contribute money. Glenwood Cemetery, Inc. is also tax exempt, but it's a 501c13, which doesn't have the same, I don't know what you say, foundations don't recognize it in their giving. So that's why, one of the reasons why we formed the foundation. And but it's been very successful. And look forward to many, many more years of raising funds to keep, it's expensive to keep our monuments looking the way they are, keeping them as clean as they are. Monuments tend to lean this way and that way. And, it's an ongoing thing. And we've got 88 acres loaded with statuary. And, it's something that you have to stay on to keep it up. And the foundation, the funds that we raise through the foundation allow us to do that. And
one of the things I remember from the last big round of restoration was that the Johnson Monument that I showed, the Gothic one. I remember that the top of it had kind of rotated around over the years and it looked like it was headed toward falling off the base. And I think it was just from 100 and something years of vibrations that it was. But things like that you don't think about either. You think about foundation problems and this and that, but
Well, that's true. We probably re-rotated it.
yeah, and I think tied it together so that it doesn't
it
wander
together.
again, right? Well, that's what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of these monuments, they didn't put them together with any kind of internal. The pieces of them were not tied together internally because they thought, well, this is heavy and it's never going to go anywhere. But they didn't count on 150 years of trains and truck traffic on Washington Avenue and all that kind of thing that can make them vibrate slightly and move over the years. So
Yeah, we've had to come in with several of our monuments and lift them up with our tractor, put a dowel in, and then rejoin it together to where somebody can't come over and push it over or it fall over. And it's a liability issue also.
yeah, well, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's see, we have a question from David about how many people are laid to rest in Glenwood.
About 24,000. Roughly, give or take.
And I know that the question came up last month, but it's probably worth repeating. Is there room left?
Yes, there is. Based on our undeveloped property and our developed property, we have about at least 60 years worth of future lot inventory left. Probably more than that. It depends how smart people are later on, as you go down, how creative people get, but 60 years for sure, and probably more than that.
Well,
that's provided we don't acquire any adjacent land. We're landlocked right now, but you never know when something might become available to buy. And so I'm sure the future managements or even current ones would try to do that.
Yeah. Let's see. I think we can have a couple more here to wrap up. Let's see. A lot of people have asked, they have mentioned that they might have missed part of this program or they missed last month or will have to miss next month. We are recording all of these sessions, and Carmen, I think you're off screen, but I think we could probably email everybody today the link to the recording from last month as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So if you missed last month, and I know you may not have found out about these programs until recently, we'll give you the chance to watch that full recording, and you'll receive a link to watch a full recording of today's. So if you came in late, if there was something that you missed for some reason, you'll have a chance to catch up on it. Let's see. And someone asked if there was a monument in Glenwood that represents the oil business, because there are many oilmen buried in Glenwood, and there's not that I know of, unless I'm missing something, Dick.
I haven't seen a derrick in here.
You never know.
No, they're really, to my knowledge, I don't think we have anything that actually says this is oil or this is gas, but we have a lot of people who are in the business buried here.
There's a
property here.
There's an interesting section kind of at the very back of the cemetery where there's a row of oilmen who are buried side by side, I think by coincidence, but that's it almost looks like they planned it. But
oh, you're talking about Blaffer, Cullinan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that they were competitive. One was Texaco, and the other was Humble Oil, Exxon. And it's my understanding they didn't get along. So I'm not sure why they were buried next door to each other.
Maybe it was a mistake.
That's hearsay, but anyway,
right.
Those were two of the major oil companies at that time in the world, and it was that was a big deal 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And one other question, I think we can end on this one. Patrick asked if there are any other Art Deco monuments in Glenwood to mention. I talked about Howard Hughes and I talked about Craven's. I think Annette Finnegan's family monument. I'm not sure if it's exactly Art Deco, but it reminds me of Art Deco. It's got a beautiful kind of upright, low relief sculpture that makes me think of that. Does anything come to your mind, Dick?
No, I know where the Finnegan Monument is, and it's I wouldn't consider it Art Deco. It may be, I'm not an expert in that area, but it's a very beautiful monument. I can tell you that.
The Hurd monument that I showed that has the
Now
solitude statue on it.
that would be, I would think,
Yeah, I think
very
that
unique. And
that's a
I've
really
also,
great one.
yeah, I've also heard that's a very significant piece of artwork. So
One of the interesting stories from that that I didn't tell, the story is, if you know Houston art, you may have heard the name Emma Richardson Cherry, who was a local artist, and apparently Emma Richardson Cherry happened to be in Paris when Ethel Hurd was in Paris shopping for the piece to put on the gravesite, and so Emma Richardson Cherry helped her pick that piece out, which I think is a neat Houston connection as well. Well, this has been fun. I hope it's been fun for you, Dick.
it has, and I want to again thank everybody for taking the time on Saturday morning to listen to both Jim and I, and we'll be back at it again in September, I understand. So
we will. That's what they tell us anyway. You can find information on the upcoming September program at preservationhouston.org or glenwoodcemetery.org. You will need to do the same thing you did for today and sign up for that in advance so that we can make sure to send you the link and the information that you'll need to tune in. As we said, you'll be getting an email in the next few days, follow up to today, with a link to watch today's recording and the recording from July. And we'll hope to see you back here next month.